Welcome to the second webinar of our series, Growing the Critical Zone Research Network. This webinar is entitled Modeling the Critical Zone. We welcome any questions that you might have throughout the webinar as well, and encourage you to ask them in the question and answer box below. The presenters will be able to address them directly after the webinar, and we really look forward to hearing your thoughts. Once again, thank you for tuning in to the second installment of the 2020 Quasi-Winter Webinar Series, Growing the Critical Zone Research Network. I will pass it off to our host, Lee, and she can introduce herself and our speakers for today.
Okay, so welcome everyone for being here. So my name is Lily from Penn State University. I will be co-hosting this panel 2 on modeling the critical zone with Nicole Gasparini from Tulane University. So I'm going to talk a couple of slides about what this is about as intro. I know there's some repeating folks, but it's good to set the stage for everyone on the same page. So all this seminar series is part of our research coordination network funded by National Science Foundation. The goal is really to increase the diversity, inclusion, and access of researchers in critical zone science. And for this CyberSeminar, we're hoping to introduce concepts in critical zone science, ways that undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, and early career scientists can get involved. We're hoping to connect scientists to ask and answer questions, and then inspire the next generation of inclusive leaders. So on that end, first of all, what is a critical zone science? So critical zone itself, by definition from NSF, it was defined as the zone from the treetop to the bottom of groundwater. You think about it from looking at the right figure, thinking about from atmosphere, to air, to soil, to water, bedrock, essentially the Earth's surface zone that sustains life. So the critical zone science, essentially, we're aiming to bring together people from different disciplines in earth and environmental sciences, because all the critical zone processes happen at the same time with a lot of interactions and feedback between processes that are typically studied in separate disciplines. And we're interested in processes at different scales, but also across different scales. Now, to do that, we really need diverse thoughts and skills to move forward. So here, this is where and how you can get involved. We're hoping to diversify the CESIR community to answer a lot of questions, to think about how to develop and promote approaches to quantify the CESIR systems, and to explore interactions among different processes, also to understand how the CESIR is changing as Anthropocene, and to think about what is important at what scales. So these are a lot of interesting questions and important questions. And all these panels, the discussions that you will see later, will really geared towards shaping a workshop at the end of June in this year at the Colorado School of Mines. The application details and application web pages are here, and it's due on April 1st. It's no registration fee. There's housing and food covered, with travel support, with early career scientists. So please apply and encourage your students and postdocs to apply, especially those coming from underrepresented groups. So for today's panel, we have 6 panelists. We will start from Jenny Druhan from University of Illinois. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Geology. She studies reactive transport processes in the critical zone. So Jenny, please take over.
So since I'm up first, I thought I would take a shot at explaining what we really mean when we're saying modeling the critical zone. And I'm a little nervous about that because I think there's a million different answers. So the other panelists can chime in as they come up to add to what I'll say. But in general, when we're thinking about the critical zone, and as we heard last week when we were learning all about characterization and data sets, there's a lot of complicated processes that go into creating this structure that we rely upon for resources. And so, for example, if you're standing on a hill slope You might be asking something like, why is the soil this thick? Or why do the trees root this deeply? Or why is there this much water in the stream draining the hill slope? And you can imagine that there are a lot of different factors that contribute to those answers. And we as modelers are basically challenging ourselves to try and pick out from all of the different factors involved, which ones are the most important. In other words, which ones do we really need to understand in detail in order to explain why we're seeing the data that we're seeing. And so fundamentally, modeling is an exercise in simplification, making a representation of these natural systems that's simple enough that it's tractable, but not so simple that it's not useful. And so under that umbrella, the kind of the kind of modeling that I work on is referred to as reactive transport. And so here we're recognizing that in critical zone structure and function, there's a basic balance between hydrology, so delivery of water to the system as precipitation, infiltration of that water through the soil, drainage through the rock to the groundwater and ultimately into the streams, and also geochemistry that's facilitated by that water. So for example, the conversion of organic matter to CO2 by microbes requires water. The conversion of rock to secondary clays and soils requires water. And so what we're really saying here is that these are two time scales, and we need to understand how they're balanced. There's the time scale of how quickly water's moving, and there's the time scale of how quickly geochemical reactions are taking place. You can imagine in the extreme, if water's not going anywhere, then all we have to do is be good chemists. And if water's going really, really fast, then there's just no time for chemistry. The critical zone is really a balance between these two, and it's very rare that one is totally dominant over the other. And so if we're going to create a reactive transport simulation of a natural system, we need to start with observations. And I show a couple of field sites here. One you heard about last week. This is the Rivendell field site in the Eel River Critical Zone Observatory that Daniela Rempe talked about. Another one here is actually in a karst system, so that's one of my students down in a cave collecting samples. And in any of these cases, we're asking questions about why the system is behaving the way it is. For example, at the Rivendell site, we're really interested in how water converts the shale underneath this hill slope into soil, and also how that water-rock reaction translates into the chemistry of the stream draining the hill slope. And so maybe one of the funnest parts of my job is this effort to take all of the complexity of this system and turn it into something tractable. In other words, I spend a lot of time thinking about cartoons. So this is my cartoon of the Rivendell hill slope. I've isolated the particular set of processes that I think are really relevant to creating the observations that we're making in this system. Even though this is a big simplification, it's still pretty complicated when you write down the mathematics of fluid flow and chemical reactions. And so quite oftentimes we need a computer in order to solve this sort of system. So here I show a simulation where I am attempting to describe how the concentration of major cations, in this case silicon, develop in the water as it drains through this hill slope. So this is a result of how quickly the water is moving. This is a result of how reactive the water is. This is a result of how reactive the rocks are in the system. And all of this comes together, try and predict what the silicon concentrations look like in the groundwater and ultimately in the stream. Unfortunately, this is not the end of the show. Many people can make models of systems, but we have actually doing it appropriately and correctly. And so we're always going back to the natural system, making more observations, making more measurements, and asking ourselves, did we get it right? Is the model behaving correctly? And invariably, not quite. And so our job is sort of a loop between observations, developing a conceptual model, creating a simulation, and then refining it and improving it. Oftentimes the natural systems are so complicated that we go to the lab and build analogs of individual parts of the critical zone to help us understand these aspects better. And so here I show, for example, one really fun project we've got going right now where we're actually using a very, very tiny amount of a very radioactive tracer in fluid, and we're pushing it through rock cores in the laboratory. And when we do this, we put the cores in front of a special camera, and we can actually image the propagation of the water through the core in real time at very high resolution. So this is an exciting new project that's helping us to understand the pathways of fluid rock. So that, in a nutshell and one slide, is reactive transport. And if you're interested in this, then how do you get involved? Well, I think this is a perfect and timely opportunity to be talking about the subject because there happen to be a couple of brand new, very current resources available to get started. We just did a reactive transport review volume. This is made out of chapters written by different authors. It's got way too much information in it, but there's a couple of chapters in there that would be really relevant to critical zone enthusiasts. For example, Lili, who's helping to facilitate this call, wrote a chapter on watershed scale reactive transport modeling. Kate Maher and Alexis Navarre-Sichler, who you heard from last week, also did one on weathering and water-rock interaction called a cartoon from their chapter here. Again, making the cartoons is one of the best parts of modeling. There's also an elements issue that just came out recently. Elements is awesome because it's intended for a general scientific audience. So the articles in these magazines are approachable, they're fun to read, and there's a brand new issue out right now on reactive transport that Kate Maher edited. There's also a lot of online materials. I just highlight a couple of opportunities. Lili, again, who's helping to run the call, has an amazing set of YouTube videos through the John Dutton E-Education Institute. There's something called the Online Academy that's supported by the Geochemist Workbench that is full of education and resource materials. The Geochemist Workbench software itself is expensive, but there's a free student edition, and I really encourage you to check that out. And then finally, I'll just do a quick shameless plug. Alexis mentioned last week that we have a new reactive modeling summer institute starting in 2021. It's NSF funded. It's using reactive transport to help people generally learn how to think like a modeler. So it's going to combine the Summer Institute with a bunch of new developed educational materials and an online hub where you can get more resources. And then finally, I put my email down in the lower left there. Please feel free to contact me with any interest in anything that you've heard today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Our next speaker is Katy Barnhart. Katy is a research associate at University of Colorado Boulder. She studies Arctic change and landscape evolution. So Katy, you can share your screen.
Okay, so I'm Katy Barnhart. I'm at the University of Colorado, and I'm a geomorphologist who is interested in a lot of different parts of the landscape. And I would say the sort of biggest theme of my research is really thinking about this question, sort of how exactly is it that modeling can generate insight? So I sort of want to riff on the prior sort of definition of a model, because I agree it's something that it's a word we use a lot. It can mean many different things. And I like to think of it as sort of a conceptual, mathematical, or numerical representation of a system that is relating inputs to outputs. And in sort of iterating between observations that are inputs, observations that are outputs, and observations that help us inform how we sort of represent the system, we are iterating towards sort of a more refined idea of how a system is represented for us. Often it's specific to a specific purpose. So you can see I have my own little like iteration of modeling diagram as well. I have worked on a variety of landscapes, sort of from icy Arctic coasts to sort of humid, temperate watersheds, on 10,000-year long timescales. Right now, I do a lot of work collecting and modeling with high-resolution drone imagery in debris flow areas, and in the next few years, I'm going to sort of continue into the hazard space and thinking a lot about debris flow inundation. But I'd say the sort of a main theme of how I like to do work is trying to find and further constrain natural experiments. So these are sites where we have really only one parameter or one process varying, and using those as formal test cases for how that particular aspect of the system works. And then I use a lot of model analysis techniques. These are things like sensitivity analysis, calibration, validation, and prediction under uncertainty. And I like to use them in thinking about both how you can use those techniques to understand the system better. So things like, which inputs really control a particular output, what type of data gives me the most constraint on whether the system is better represented by equation set 1 or equation set 2, and so forth. And then the final thing that I'd like to highlight is I'm involved in the open source software efforts. Specifically, I'm very involved on the Land Lab project. So this is a open source sort of, I like to think of it as a toolbox or a sort of a sandbox for 2D numerical models. So we provide general tools like for representing a domain, as well as a number of sort of off-the-shelf capabilities for representing specific types of physical processes. Thus far, most of the processes are focused in long-ish term landscape evolution and ecohydrology, but the goal is for the package to sort of grow with the community interest. I've used it to create a package called Terrain Bento, which is a multi-model analysis package. And then I'm also a topical editor at the Journal of Open Source Software, which is a outlet for having code software packages reviewed and considered as where appropriate, like journal publications. So there are two places that I see as most important and exciting for getting involved. I'll highlight first ways you can contribute to open source software. You don't need any coding experience to do this. I'd say one of the most important things that people can do is just pointing out where things don't make sense. So the way the documentation gets refined is that people say, this doesn't make sense. This is what would make more sense to me, or fixing typos or so forth. Finding bugs, asking questions on an open platform so that other people can learn from the question you have. If you have that question, someone else probably does. And then, other ways to contribute sort of go all the way up into contributing to source code. We also are always looking for reviewers at JOS, people who are willing to try out software and review it as part of the publication process. And then the other thing I'd like to highlight is that oftentimes in using modeling to generate insight, we need to find these natural experiments. And any research effort will contribute to sort of our community's efforts to have natural experiments and sort of identify natural experiments out of all of the places that we're doing research. So with that, I'll finish.
Thank you, Katy. Our next speaker is Alison Anders. So Alison is from University of Illinois as well, from Department of Geology. She is also a geomorphologist. Alison, can you share your screen?
Yeah, okay, excellent. All right, well, so a lot of what I'm gonna say is gonna repeat what you've heard already to some extent. But my interaction with the idea of the critical zone came from my work in the intensively managed landscapes critical zone observatory. And there, I think the first and maybe most important thing we did there was think about what our conceptual model of the critical zone was and how that was different from sort of early or previous statements about how the critical zone works. So thinking about the critical zone as being everything from the top of the vegetation down into the depth of reactive bedrock. Can you see that arrow? Yeah. We think about our landscape here in the Midwest during interglacial periods having a soil developing in the materials near the surface and maybe deposition in floodplains and some kind of ecosystem on the top. And then as glaciation happens here, we get new materials brought in, we get changes to the ecosystem, we get burial of some older weathering profiles, and then the glaciers leave and there's a different ecosystem again and new formation of soils, and then landscape change. So river valleys start to re-establish themselves. So the process of going through this discussion of what is the critical zone and what's it made out of in our part of the world really highlighted this big conclusion that the critical zone is changing over glacial, interglacial cycles in a big way. And for me as a geomorphologist, I was really interested in the fact that river networks as part of the critical zone are changing at this time scale a lot too. So from there, we got to thinking about why or what drives changes in those river systems, and identified a key unknown feature here, which was the fact that after glaciation happens, we end up with lots and lots of closed depressions on the land surface, not connected to external drainage networks. But we don't know necessarily what happens to the water that falls into those closed depressions on the surface. And turns out that's going to make a huge difference for how the landscape will evolve through time. So with this question in mind, then we develop a series of numerical landscape evolution models. So this is a small domain, it's 1 kilometer on a side, and we're imagining there's a big river valley that exists here along the left edge of all of these models. And we have an initial surface that's got some roughness in it, so it's got some shallow closed depressions. And then we run the model forward and say, what would happen if we had 20,000 years of evolution of streams in the case that we could only get water from the true uphill catchments of all these little stream heads? And what happens is not that much. You sort of grow a lot of teeny tiny streams in from the edge of the model. But if instead you say these surface water closed depressions fill up to their spill points and spill out to the edge, then you can grow a much more dendritic drainage network in that same amount of time. And then we add into the mix, well, what if some of the water in these closed depressions actually travels through the subsurface across these very subtle surface water divides and reaches the growing channel heads? And in that case, if we introduce some groundwater, some fraction of the water coming as groundwater, we get significantly more propagation of those channels. And there's some differences in the morphology. So they tend to have these kind of amphitheater shaped channel heads. And if we both route water out of closed depressions and allow some of it to move as groundwater, then we get even faster sort of growth of stream networks. So this is an example of how the inspiration was really going back to thinking about what do we mean by the critical zone in this landscape? What are the things that we don't know about the critical zone and how it has changed through time? And then saying, well, it matters. This behavior of the water in closed depressions matters because we would have very different stream networks over time, depending on which of these is happening when and where. So as far as thinking about new scientists getting involved with the critical zone research, I think that there's a lot of room in the critical zone research world to develop new conceptual models of what do we mean exactly by this. So I've got this slide here. I think of this as kind of a first statement of critical zone science that really emphasizes a one-dimensional view of fresh bedrock at some depth being uplifted and weathered over time and producing this feed-through reactor. So this is really different from the critical zone conceptual model that I showed you for the intensively managed landscapes, where material is brought in laterally and there's all this really important time variability as far as what's in the critical zone and what's happening in the critical zone. So here's a different conceptual model. This is from a French critical zone critical zone research, and they're emphasizing much more of a sort of a watershed view. We want to think about the critical zone, and we have to think about this issue of water moving, like Jenny mentioned. And so we have to think at these longer spatial scales. This is an example of work that's not being formally done in the intensively managed landscapes critical zone observatory, but I think a new dimension for conceptual models that comes out of the work in the IML-CZO, which is the idea that humans and human actors are significant in driving what's going on in the critical zone in lots and lots of places on Earth. And so this is a recent paper looking at how humans both respond to changes in the critical zone and induce changes in the critical zone. So there's a coupled system there that could be developed further. And here's a place for add your idea. Okay, what kind of conceptual model could you develop to think about a part of the critical zone that's been underexplored, or a place that we haven't thought about, or some other aspect of critical zone science. So I think starting by developing and publishing new conceptual models of what's going on is really important. The second thing that people can do to get involved is just to go ahead and make some numerical models of critical zone processes. I wrote coupled numerical models because I think for my understanding of the critical zone, I think we really have to think about how different parts of the critical zone are interacting with each other. And so they're coupled processes and there's feedback. And I'm pointing out here, these are 4 different resources for getting open source code. So LandLab, I use LandLab as well. There's a larger model repository at CSDMS. There's stuff at Quasi. I use this parallel ice sheet model. This is an open source collaborative model of ice sheet dynamics. So there's a lot of this stuff out there, and you can take your conceptual model and pick up and refine pieces of code that already exist to start working on developing new coupled models. And I would actually, I want to re-emphasize what Katy said, just get involved with the open source model community and participate in that, using the resources as well as creating them. So if you have any questions about my research or what else you can do to get involved, my email is on there and I'd be happy to try to answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah. Thanks, Alison. Okay, next up we have Ying von Reinfelder. She's a professor at Rutgers.
So a bunch of us work on the critical zone, but really at a very, very large scale, at the global scale. In this animation, you can see basically the breathing of the critical zone, right? That's the moisture and oxygen sent into the atmosphere and the CO2 pulled in, basically. So we ask this very, very simple question at this level. How does the critical zone regulate global scale mass energy cycles in modern days, in the future, and in the past as well? And so this far away, we really can't directly observe the processes. So we rely on models big time. But the models are based on the synthesis of field observations and the theories and the conceptual models. I really like what Jennifer said, the cartoon view of the world. This is where critical zone comes into important play in the global models. These global models, I have a cartoon here showing what we call the Earth system models that you basically couple the atmosphere, the ocean, the lithosphere, the biosphere, etc. At a very, very broad scale and a very simple level, Earth system level. And right now, the critical zone, you can see it's in this model, but it's not very well described. For example, how deep should it be in these models? It's basic question determines water storage, determines plant carbon cycle, nutrient cycle, and it's very poorly constrained. We pretty much, guess a number, 2 meters everywhere in the world, maybe 5 meters everywhere in the world. So this is a very fundamental model property that is very poorly constrained just because we really don't know how deep the critical zone is. What is the porosity permeability change with the depth? Should it just have a sharp cutoff at a certain depth? Or should be a gradual change in permeability porosity? So these are open questions that will really depend on critical zone findings. The idea is for us, first modelers, is to rely on synthesis. And that's our approach, right? Basically pick out, as Jennifer said, the critical or the really important patterns and processes that we know will hold true everywhere. And so this process will depend on these people that you heard from last week and today, really making observations and analyze the data and come up with new conceptual models, new cartoons, new theories. Then we can put in the global models. But we do another level of synthesis, another layer of filtering, because we really have to decide what processes that matter, not only in one critical zone, but really in major portions of the land surface. So this is basically the question we're asking. And using this example of how deep the critical zone should be, and here are some hypotheses. And 4 theories, 4 drivers basically considered in isolation. And we really need to follow through. And what the tectonics and hydrology and the energy balance on north and south facing side and the propagation of the chemical fronts, how do they work together to really shape the critical zone? We really need to understand that so we can actually predict just even some rough idea of how thick this layer is, so we can put into the global models. And it really will make a huge difference. So I want to say that in the end, the critical zone science can really transform the Earth system models. And right now, it's not doing what we hope it's doing. And then a few words on why a career in CZ science. And this is really for the grad students thinking, deciding what team to join, what to study. And I think there are really two very good reasons. One is that the CZ is the habitat for humanity. We have profoundly transformed the critical zone. And what are the consequences to the critical zone functioning? Our soil loss, for example, our food is grown here, ecosystem that sustains us grow here. So you can really make an impact by understanding what critical zone does to the Earth system and how are we transforming it. Secondly, critical zone science is really cool and fun and new in that it really focuses on the interactions among the established, well-established, solidly established disciplines, climate science, forestry, social science, ecology, hydrology, soil science. We have been studying those disciplines for 200 years, right? But now the critical zone puts a spotlight, not on the discipline disciplines themselves, but the interactions, this tangled web, how A happens and influence B, etc. So in a way, this is really fun. This is a whole new frontier because in nature, these disciplines have really no real boundaries. There are some focuses, but not boundaries. And here, CZ is breaking the boundaries. And as to how to get involved, I really recommend that if you're a grad student, read the CZ papers, find papers that are synthesis level and read in great detail. And if you read, you're going to be so well informed, you can ask very intelligent questions. Then you can really contact the CZ scientists, examples shown here, that really resonate with you. And you can bounce ideas, you can decide who you are, what you really want to do. And then meanwhile, broaden your knowledge and take courses outside your comfort zone, take courses in other departments, other schools. So that's all I have.
Great, thank you so much, Ying. All right, next we will have Crystal Ying. She is an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. Crystal, if you want to unmute yourself and share your screen.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
Yes, go for it.
All right, great. Well, I just wanted to say that I'm really excited to be part of this webinar because I think right now is really the right time to be thinking about growing the critical zone research network. And let me just tell you why I think that. So, So I think that some of you probably have heard of critical zone observatories, but if you've not, these are intensively studied sites across the United States that are funded by the National Science Foundation, where big groups of scientists have come together and really put their minds together and their resources together to really figure out how do all these different processes that make up the critical zone actually come together. And these have been really, really instrumental for really getting critical zone science off the ground. Okay, so this is where I have to confess, I do not do research in the critical zone. So the first time that I was ever invited to talk about my modeling work in a critical zone session, I actually wondered, was this a mistake? And so I wanted to actually figure out, does my work really, can I really be part of critical zone science? And so this was actually at the AGU 2018 meeting. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a huge geosciences conferences. And so I actually went through the presentation abstracts for all the different sessions on the critical zone in that year. And there were about 93 abstracts that actually said, where they were doing research for this critical zone science. And well, what I found was that, yeah, there's still a lot of really awesome science coming out of critical zone observatories or other similar types of intensively studied sites. But we really are expanding critical zone science. Actually, the majority of the studies actually were in other locations. Now, my research, a lot of my research is actually in Ecuador. So I kind of probed a little bit farther about where this critical zone science was happening. And I actually found that still the vast majority of the studies still are looking at sites where they are in resource-richer countries. So I guess I really want to sort of encourage everyone out there to, help us expand critical zone science. We are expanding, but let's get out even farther. And what I'd like to actually kind of argue with you is that I think that one really effective way of expanding critical zone science is using models. And so just want to give a couple really quick examples from my work as to why I think models are really such a great way of doing this. So in Ecuador, I'm interested in looking at tropical glaciarized watersheds. And I realize this sounds like an oxymoron, tropical glaciers, but there are glaciers on the top of very high mountains in the tropics. And what's so concerning is that these are also the places where some of the fastest rates of warming are occurring. So this means that glaciers are retreating really rapidly there. And this leads to all kinds of questions like what's going to happen to water supplies for people living just below these tropical glaciers. And so, okay, here's the challenge with this though. In order to figure out how melt is getting somehow down to streams where people can get it, it's actually passing through all different kinds of pathways. It's going through fractures in the mountains. It's going into soils where then plants can be taking it up. So there's things going on in the surface, in the subsurface, things going on with biology. Okay, So obviously it would take a lot of data to understand what's going on here, but it's hard to get to these remote kinds of places. We probably only get out there about once a year, and we can't access a lot of areas. So we can really only see what's on the surface. So this is where models really come and save the day here. So models, especially critical zone models or integrated models that combine a lot of different types of processes, this, I think, really provides the hope of us being able to interpolate between the places and the times when we actually can go out to measure things. So in our work, we have been applying an integrated hydrologic model called RT FluxPIM that's out of Lili's lab at Penn State, and we're applying it to a tropical glaciarized watershed in Chimborazo, Ecuador. And so I think we've already heard some great explanations of how some of these models work. So I'm just gonna kind of hopefully grab your interest by what we can try to learn from some of these models. So remember, we only get out to the site maybe just once a year, but with the model, we can start to estimate over the course of the year, as we've got on the x-axis here, we can actually try to see day to day how much melt is getting into streams. And what we were able to learn only with the model, not with just once a year measurements, is that it varies considerably, which is really important for water resources issues. And plus, this model doesn't just capture physical processes, right? We're in the critical zone. This is a critical zone model. It's also capturing geochemical processes. And so even though a lot of people have been thinking about water resources, we were able to run scenarios with the model with glacier melt, without glacier melt, to figure out how much glacier melt is actually contributing to maybe something like nutrient export from these watersheds. Okay, I just want to end with one other really quick example, just to show you that you don't have to go to far-flung places just to be expanding critical zone science. So I've also been working just in my backyard in Minnesota in wild rice lakes and streams. And perhaps you've eaten wild rice before, and perhaps you've not, but the important thing that I want to point out is that wild rice is a profoundly important natural and cultural resource for Native peoples in the Great Lakes region. It's sacred for them, which means it's sacred for them, but it's also threatened by a whole host of different environmental stressors, which means that protecting it is really a matter of environmental justice and equity, an issue that resonates globally. Okay, so what does this have to do with the critical zone? Well, one of the major threats to wild rice is high concentrations of sulfate that are discharged by mining. But the thing is, whether or not this discharge actually affects wild rice depends on just how groundwater and surface water are interacting with each other and how that sulfate geochemically reacts with other organic substrates and with sediments. And so, as you can see, this is a critical zone science question. And so we've been trying to understand what are these vulnerable times using reactive transport models, which luckily we just heard a lot about earlier in this webinar. Okay, but where we really think that we're kind of pushing into new territory with critical zone science here is that we realize that if we're looking at an issue of environmental justice and equity, it was essential to be bringing in Native partners into this project. And after we really put in the time to build relationships with them and to really build trust with them, really, really key steps here, they started to share a bit of how they understand wild rice, or they call it Monoman in the Ojibwe language. And what they explained to us is that they always think about wild rice in relationship to all the other components that's around in the environment, the sediment, the water, the climate, the plants, the animals. And what really struck me here is that we think that critical zone science is really new and edgy, but indigenous knowledge of our tribal partners, they've long been thinking about the whole system holistically. And on top of that, they've always been thinking about the role of people in this system as well. And as we've just heard, that's just coming in newer in our critical zone science of interdisciplinary work of thinking of the role of humans. And so this all led me to think, one of our biggest challenges in critical zone science is thinking about how do we connect in our models all these different disciplines that we used to model separately. And so here by diversifying the team that we are working with, we have a chance through something that that some of us are starting to call community engaged modeling. We can actually be more effective in thinking about how these different pieces do fit together in the critical zone. So I've just shared with you some of the ways that I've discovered that I can be part of critical zone science. So I'm giving you an ugly, just long list of of some things here, some thoughts as well. So actually my first list here of professional associations or organizations probably seems really obvious, but I actually just put this on here to really emphasize that when we're thinking about critical zone science, we probably really do need to lean on collaborations in order to work across these different traditional disciplines. And so some of these are just, if you're already involved in geosciences, you obviously already know about HEU, GSA, Quasi. I just want to remind you that if you're early career students, they've got great programs for you now. Also, you know, in order to be collaborative, I think it's really important to feel like you are part of a community, and hopefully, you know, HEU, GSA, Quasi will do that for you, but there might be other ways of looking for community as well. And just because I've been working with a lot of Native students, I've just included a few organizations that are focused around them. And finally, this last piece of thinking about the role of humans in the critical zone, that's yet the next step in interdisciplinary work. And just wanted to point out there's a center called Singha that has a lot of resources for funding workshops as well. So funding sources, I just wanted to point out that it's not just critical zone observatories anymore. There are other programs, for example, at NSF that bring in that human element. And also, you know, I've been tracking what's been funded by hydrologic sciences, which is the discipline that I most closely relate to. And I'm finding that a lot of what has been funded isn't just a tight box around hydrology, but I think even when in these discipline-specific programs, where people are starting to think about how it relates to other things. And finally, it's not just, you know, I think we've mentioned NSF, but it's not just NSF that is funding critical zone science either. The Department of Energy has intensive study sites called SFAs that are very akin to critical zone observatories, and they also have funding programs. And lastly, and probably I'll just let you look up these resources yourself. There are a number of different modeling resources. And again, if we're really thinking about kind of expanding and growing our critical zone network, it's really great to be thinking about open source and accessible resources. And here are just some ways of finding that, and a couple examples just from my own research. So if any of this interests you, please feel free to visit my website and to just shoot me an email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Caroline, if you want to share your screen and unmute yourself. And
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I think as the last speaker, I've reverted to what Jenny might consider the sort of primal state here of a modeler, which is a singular cartoon. And I'm hoping what I can talk about today is to give you an example of how we're combining some of the influences of models and processes that have been described by the previous speakers into an understanding in an Earth system model. And Ying provided a really nice example of what Earth system models are and can do. And I'm hoping that I can use this singular pattern-filled box to argue for why Earth system models are a useful tool, not just for climate, but for understanding the critical zone, and also for how we might be thinking about expanding the disciplines for which we should be thinking about critical zone science up into the atmosphere for some coupled feedbacks. And so this is soil. And what we're thinking about in our research is trying to understand how soil changes. And so of course, there's a number of things that can define soil as being distinct from each other, but one particular influence to the critical zone is soil structure. And so the pathways available to water, air, and nutrients as they move through soil, either laterally or vertically. Some soils might have larger, for instance, macropores, the biggest pores available for water through which water is moving the fastest. Whereas other soils might have much smaller macropores to the point where there might be none at all. And these are interesting in their own right because they're mediated not just by the geology available to form the soil or the climate helping make the soils from that rock, but also because of the interplay of plants and their roots and the microbial communities that link all of that together in the soils and how they create structure. And of course, soil structure and therefore its ability to move water and air and nutrients has a lot of influence on the kinds of plants that can grow on top of the soils in different places, the animals and ecosystems that evolve around those, the landforms that develop, and then of course how humans interact with those surfaces, how we make money, how we recreate, how we sort of go about day-to-day life. And there's been emerging evidence that So while we understand that soils is the sort of key linkage tying together so much of the critical zone, form in response to a myriad of processes and emerging from different disciplines, as well as over particularly long time scales, there's new research that's come out suggesting that soils are actually changing faster than we had ever really thought, on the order of 3 to 5 to 10 years. And that's because of the role of those microbial communities. And as a result, what we're seeing is that in places that are getting more rain, more snow over the course of the year, there's a decrease in macroporosity, a decrease in pore size, and therefore a reduction in the potentially amount of water that can infiltrate into those soils. And in places where there's less rain or less snow, the opposite is happening, an increase in the macro pore size, potentially translating to things like saturated hydraulic conductivity, things that will influence our reactive transport models, things that might influence how water reacts to geomorphology and topography. And as a way to understand some of the influence of this and how we're thinking about this in our research group, is you might consider sort of a simple hill slope to channel drainage. And depending on the amount of rain, some water partitions to overland flow, some infiltrates to soil, some percolates to groundwater, and those drive reactive transport reactions, those drive soil moisture dynamics and distributions, and that drives plant growth, response, and evapotranspiration. And as a result, and perhaps one key indicator we might use is we might see a response in stream flow, a hydrograph that rises during large amounts of rain and decreases as rain itself diminishes through perhaps summer months. If soil structure is changing this quickly, what might we expect to see change to these hydrologic fluxes, and consequently to the biogeochemical fluxes and sort of that cascading realm of complexity that reacts and responds and controls these things? Well, one thing that might happen is if there's more precipitation and macropores have decreased, we might see a much greater proportion of incoming water move via overland flow pathways, reducing the amount of water moving into soils, to groundwater, and diminishing the amount of water available to drive those reactive transport reactions. So we might see what looks like a flashier hydrograph. In places with diminished precipitation, rain and snow, we might see an increase in those big soil pores, and therefore an increased capacity to soak that water up into the soils and into groundwater, resulting in a perhaps faster movement of water, albeit with less. And this might create a sort of smoother stream flow pathway. And this is all speculative at this point, of course, it's in cartoon form. And one of the key ways to be able to integrate all of these ideas is using Earth systems models. And so this is a map of I've highlighted the soil moisture term over here. This is a map of soil moisture across the continental US in January of 2060. And this was produced using the Community Earth Systems model, with the idea being that we can model forward and backward in time over large spatial scales, small scale processes that might exert change at the pore scale, and that those pore scale processes might ultimately matter with regards to hydrologic fluxes and cycles at the entire continental scale over a century. And in the case of this particular question, we're really curious about how soil moisture can, and the changes to the distribution of soil moisture might create feedbacks not just to the hydrology, not just to the biogeochemical cycles, but might potentially couple into atmospheric processes, similar to what some of Dr. Abby Swan's work has shown with regards to ecological teleconnections. And so this kind of argues for not only the importance of Earth system models as useful tools for critical zone science, but also thinking broadly about the kinds of disciplines that we incorporate, because as Crystal just pointed out, we connect so many different things in these fields. And so thinking if you're an atmospheric scientist, if you're working in larger scale synoptic weather patterns, these might be influenced by processes happening at a pore scale. And those are the kinds of connections that are so exciting and interesting to be able to model with Earth systems models and with critical zones science. And so a couple sort of curated potential resources, as I think a lot of the panelists before me have recommended. A good overview article is a great place to get your sort of introduction to a field and to the relevant pieces. And this is a great one going through the history of Earth system models and some of their variety of applications. If you prefer a longer book, this is a great general audience pop science book describing the history of photosynthetic research and the role that Earth system science and some critical zone feedbacks can play into it. The National Center for Atmospheric Research, who builds and maintains the Community Earth Systems model, has just revamped their online tutorial option. So it's a free online class. So if you're curious to try out the Community Earth Systems model, if you're curious to do Earth Systems modeling in your own time, you can go and check out this link here and go through all of their tutorials and practicals to try it for yourself. And if you'd like to and have the resources to be able to go in person, they offer an in-person tutorial with the same materials twice a year where you can learn from the scientists who built and maintain this model and think about how you might be able to apply it to some of your own research questions. And then if you want to get paid to do it, there's a postdoc opening right now at Boise State University where you can work on this very question and work with a really awesome group of people modeling across scales in critical zone science. And if you are interested in that, I'd encourage you to get in touch with my PI, Dr. Lejo Flores, with a recent CV to express your interest. And so I just wanted to thank all of the organizers and all of the fellow panelists and all of you for staying tuned and sharing some really cool information. I know I learned a lot, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And I apologize, in the rush, I did not properly introduce Caroline. So in the my post-introduction is going to be Caroline Nash, and she's a postdoc currently at Boise State University.
So thank you again to everyone who presented today. I know I learned a lot and really appreciate all of your guys' hard work. And all the work you guys are working on seems incredibly interesting. So thank you to everyone who presented and everyone who attended this workshop. I just wanted to give a quick overview of the opportunities at Quasi that are coming up to add to this list of resources that all the presenters have already shared. Quasi is a nonprofit organization focusing on supporting the water science community. And in addition to these webinars, we host a number of in-person educational workshops and grant opportunities. Kind of relevant to modeling, we have 2 workshops coming up that with applications open right now. The first one is our Wharf Hydro Modeling System Workshop at NCAR in Boulder. Applications for that close February 28th. Applications for our precipitation estimation and analysis using remotely sensed information at UC Irvine close March 25th. Both of these workshops are open to anyone in the water science community, and there is travel support available for graduate students. After this webinar series, we're hosting another virtual town hall where we'll hear from the National Science Foundation Hydrologic Science Program Managers and have the opportunity to ask questions on March 18th. So this is another opportunity to work with the community and learn about opportunities at NSF. Applications are also open for our Instrumentation Discovery Travel Grant. This grant gives students and early career faculty or researchers funding to learn more about a new sensor methodology from experts, and applications will close on April 5th for that. Finally, we have a save the date for our quasi-biennial colloquium. It will be held in July and is a great opportunity to engage with the water science community and to share your science. Please check out the Quasi website for more information on any of these programs and to sign up for a newsletter and follow us on social media. You'll get updates on these upcoming opportunities as well as everything that we have going on. Additionally, if you feel free to reach out to me directly with any questions or feedback. And thank you again for tuning in. We hope you will join us again next week, same time, same place. But for now, let me pass it back to see if we have any additional questions.
It doesn't look like we have any questions on the Q&A that have not been at least given some kind of answer. Any of the panelists who want to chime in on any of those questions, feel free to open up the Q&A and add your answers there. I have a feeling with the time we're going to be losing people, but we can stay open for a couple more minutes. And the other thing I just want to remind everyone, next week our webinar is going to be on broadly sorry, off the top of my head, it's the Anthropocene and the critical zone. And our last webinar in 2 weeks will be on diversifying and improving inclusion in the critical zone. And so we'd love to see everyone at those 2 webinars coming up. And please don't forget about applying to our workshop that we're going to have this summer in Colorado in June. The deadline for that is April 1st. Do we have any of our panelists who might be interested in answering this question? Uncertainty and its propagation in CZ modeling. If Katy Barnhart is still on the line, she can maybe address that question.
I am still here. Sorry. So I think that one of the things that I've found sort of most useful is that thinking about uncertainty and prediction under uncertainty really forces you to think very carefully about what exactly it is you're modeling, what exactly it is that you are trying to constrain the uncertainty of, and then how things are sort of connected. I think there's a lot of work that can be done in applying existing methodologies for sort of uncertainty quantification and propagation into the context of critical zone and sort of Earth's surface and system broadly construed. I think the other thing that I would say is that oftentimes there are challenges that are distinct for that sort of using these kinds of methods in Earth system research sort of bring up. An example that I've been thinking a little bit about recently is that, you know, you would typically expect, for example, that if you had more parameters that a model should be able to perform better because it has more degrees of freedom to fit something, but more parameters isn't exactly the same in like a numerical model with a variety of processes than it is in maybe a statistical model. So sometimes that is the case and sometimes it isn't. So then you end up with some interesting things in sort of multi-model comparison. But I think I'll sort of close my long answer by saying that I think it really depends on exactly the application that you're talking about. But one of the things that's nice about thinking carefully about uncertainty is that rather than sort of saying, oh, I'm interested in, you know, being sort of descriptive in what you're thinking about, it really forces you to think about, well, what exactly are you trying to constrain the uncertainty of? I have a feeling if Crystal is still around, she may have some things to talk about, but she may not be around.
I am. Yeah, so I think that certainly one complication with looking at uncertainty in critical zone models is the computational just complexity grows when you start adding more components together. So doesn't mean you can't do it, but it certainly is a challenge. And I think it's, but it also in some ways makes it more important to realize or to try to just figure out what are the greater sources of your uncertainty. So I think this isn't necessarily answering, I guess, the direction about uncertainty and its propagation, except for maybe just an acknowledgement that it is important and that there are, complications, especially when a lot of the kind of more typical approaches are doing, Monte Carlo assessments. So just running your model a lot of different times. So, but I think that there are, I think that I think it's a challenge to take on though. And I think that, there are some ways you can isolate different components of the model to do this in kind of a preliminary way. But yeah, I definitely see this as being just one of those challenges of moving forward with critical of integrated coupled models.
Thank you so much, Crystal and Katie, for taking on those questions. So I think we should probably wrap up given the time. I want to thank one more time all of our participants, all of our panelists, and just remind everyone we hope to see you and hear from you again next week.